a seat at the table. The African Union joins the G20. The African Union's recent inclusion in the Group of 20 marks a pivotal moment in global economic governance. For the first time, a major multilateral organization representing the African continent sits at the table with the world's most powerful economies. This newfound influence offers a unique opportunity to address the pressing issue of Africa's mounting debt burden. The G20's decisions have a profound impact on developing countries, and Africa is no exception. The continent faces a growing debt crisis, exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic, climate change, and global economic shocks. Africa's external debt stock has more than doubled over the past decade, reaching over $700 billion in 2022. This staggering figure represents a significant drain on national budgets, diverting resources away from essential public services such as healthcare, education, and infrastructure. The debt burden is further compounded by high interest rates, volatile commodity prices, and limited access to concessional financing. This toxic combination of factors stifles economic growth, perpetuates poverty, and undermines sustainable development. The African Union's membership in the G20 provides a platform to amplify African voices and advocate for policies that promote debt sustainability and economic resilience. The AU can leverage its position to push for reforms that address the root causes of the debt crisis and create a more equitable global financial system. This includes advocating for greater debt transparency, responsible lending and borrowing practices, and enhanced access to affordable financing. The G20 has a responsibility to listen to the concerns of African nations and work collaboratively to find solutions that benefit all members. A prosperous and stable Africa is in the best interest of the entire global community. The AU's participation in the G20 is not merely symbolic, it is a crucial step towards achieving a more just and equitable world order. It is time for the G20 to recognize the urgency of the debt crisis facing Africa and take concrete actions to support its sustainable development. The weight of debt. A crisis for Africa. Africa's debt crisis is not a new phenomenon. The continent has been grappling with high debt levels for decades, often a legacy of colonialism, structural adjustment programs, and irresponsible lending practices. However, the current debt crisis is particularly acute, driven by a confluence of internal and external factors that have pushed many African countries to the brink. The COVID-19 pandemic has had a devastating impact on African economies, leading to sharp declines in government revenues and export earnings. Lockdowns and disruptions to global supply chains have further exacerbated existing vulnerabilities, pushing millions into poverty and reversing hard-won development gains. Climate change poses an existential threat to the continent, with more frequent and severe droughts, floods, and other extreme weather events wreaking havoc on agriculture, infrastructure, and livelihoods. The economic fallout from these climate shocks is adding to the debt burden, as governments are forced to borrow heavily to finance disaster relief and reconstruction efforts. The war in Ukraine has sent shockwaves through the global economy, leading to soaring food and energy prices, supply chain disruptions, and increased financial instability. African countries, heavily reliant on imports of food, fuel, and fertilizers, have been hit particularly hard. The rising cost of living is fueling social unrest and political instability, further undermining efforts to address the debt crisis. The global financial system has failed to provide adequate support to African countries facing these unprecedented challenges. Access to concessional financing remains limited, and international financial institutions have been slow to respond to the growing debt crisis. The lack of timely and adequate debt relief measures risks pushing many African countries into debt distress, with dire consequences for their populations and the global economy. A framework for relief. The promise and pitfalls of the Common Framework. In response to the growing debt crisis, the G20, together with the Paris Club, launched the Debt Service Suspension Initiative in 2020, followed by the Common Framework for Debt Treatments beyond the DSSI in 2021. These initiatives aim to provide temporary debt relief to eligible low-income countries, including many in Africa, to help them cope with the economic fallout from the COVID-19 pandemic. The DSSI allowed participating countries to suspend debt service payments to official bilateral creditors, freeing up resources to address the immediate health and economic impacts of the pandemic. The Common Framework, on the other hand, was designed as a more comprehensive and durable solution, aiming to provide debt restructuring and relief to countries facing unsustainable debt burdens. It recognized that temporary debt service suspension was insufficient and that a more structured approach was needed to address the root causes of debt distress. However, the Common Framework has been plagued by several shortcomings since its inception. One of the main criticisms is its narrow scope, as it only applies to official bilateral debt, excluding debt owed to private creditors, multilateral development banks, and commercial lenders. This limited scope undermines the effectiveness of the framework, as private creditors, who now hold a significant portion of developing countries' debt, are not bound by its provisions. The lack of private creditor participation has made it difficult to achieve meaningful debt relief for many countries, as they are reluctant to provide debt restructuring without similar commitments from other creditors. Moreover, the Common Framework has been criticized for its lack of transparency and slow pace of implementation. The process of negotiating debt treatments under the framework has been opaque and time-consuming, with delays often attributed to a lack of coordination among creditors and disagreements over debt sustainability assessments. This lack of transparency has created uncertainty for debtor countries, hindering their ability to plan for the future and attract much-needed investment. A lack of transparency. The need for open dialogue. One of the most significant shortcomings of the Common Framework is the lack of transparency surrounding debt restructuring negotiations. This opacity hinders the ability of debtor countries, creditors, and other stakeholders to effectively participate in the process and hold each other accountable. The lack of transparency stems from several factors, including the confidential nature of debt contracts, the reluctance of some creditors to disclose their lending terms, and the absence of a standardized framework for information sharing. This lack of openness creates an uneven playing field, where creditors often have more information than debtors, putting the latter at a disadvantage during negotiations. The lack of transparency also makes it difficult to assess the fairness and sustainability of debt restructuring agreements. Without access to comprehensive information about a country's debt stock, its terms and conditions, and the projected impact of different restructuring scenarios, it is challenging to determine whether a particular agreement adequately addresses the underlying debt sustainability issues. This lack of transparency can lead to agreements that simply kick the can down the road, providing temporary relief without addressing the structural factors that led to the debt crisis in the first place. To address this critical issue, the G20 should prioritize enhancing transparency throughout the debt restructuring process. This includes promoting greater disclosure of debt data by both borrowers and lenders, establishing clear guidelines for information sharing among creditors, and involving debtor countries and other stakeholders in the design and implementation of debt restructuring agreements. Open dialogue and information sharing are essential for building trust, fostering cooperation, and ensuring that debt restructuring agreements are fair, transparent, and contribute to long-term debt sustainability.